I'm Connie Knox.
I'm Ashley Moore.
Welcome, welcome. We're talking about cemeteries today, which is going to be fun. Yeah, let's jump in. No sense in, doing all that front end stuff. Let's just jump in. We had talked about obituaries before in one
Mhm.
of the past episodes. So if you missed that one, check it out because it's a fun one. But cemeteries, wow. I think
Yeah.
people forget about cemeteries. Now, a lot of times people research cemeteries on places like FindaGrave and Billion Graves. And for those who don't know, there's a thing called Cemetery Census as well, which is mostly East Coast. All three of those websites have great opportunities for searching your cemeteries, right? Let's just talk about those for a second. Got any tips?
Oh gosh, let's see. I love with Find a Grave, especially if you're going into the cemetery. Of course, I think a general rule would be if you're going, call ahead. But with Find a Grave, I think it's really cool. It's the only one that I know of where you can actually mark the GPS pin.
I don't know if you can do that on Billion Graves. I've never tried.
Yeah, I haven't tried that one. I'm certain that it's with Find a Grave, and that one, I think that feature is really, really interesting.
Some of my favorite tips for Find a Grave.
Hmm.
If you are researching from home and you can't physically go to the cemetery, a couple things. Leave flowers. A lot of
Yes.
people forget that. You have to actually sign in to Find a Grave. It's free, right? But you
Hmm.
sign in, and then if you leave flowers, and it's not real flowers, it's just fake
The virtual.
virtual flowers, but it's an opportunity for you to timestamp that you've been there, and you can even put your relationship to that person on that memorial, right?
Mhm.
So you could say, "This is my great grandmother." And that way, people can reach out to you through the Find a Grave platform, and you can like collaborate on stuff. Boy, it's been really helpful. A lot of people forget about that trick with leaving flowers. The other one is to search the cemetery. So if you have, like, say, been on Ancestry or someplace and you find yourself moving over to Find a Grave to look at this memorial, click on the cemetery and go search the cemetery for more names of the same surname. Because a lot of times, and maybe even if it's a female, her maiden name, her married name, whatever, and search several different names for the people that are in that area because you may find a whole mess of family that is buried in the same cemetery. So that's cool.
I also love the ability to with the flowers, that allows the collaboration, and I think that it's really great because you could be missing someone on, Ancestry if they don't answer a message just because, you don't know them or they're a little bit skeptical. That's another means that you could reach out.
So true. I forgot about that. The other thing you can do too, technically, if you're going to use the photograph from Find a Grave, technically you're supposed to give attribution to the photographer. So you can drill into the photographer and also take a look and see, this is a clue, right? If they've got thousands and thousands of memorials that they have uploaded, they're probably either somebody who works for the cemetery or somebody who just does this for fun and just does a lot, and they're not necessarily related. But if they've only got 20, 30, maybe 100 memorials that they have uploaded, they're probably related to the memorial. So you might check them out and reach out to them. Now, here's another tip too. Drill into their bio. A lot of times a photographer will say, go ahead and use my photographs. I don't care. A lot of times people will do that to avoid being pestered a lot with, can I use your photograph? Can I use your photograph? So if
Yeah.
you're going to upload those photographs to places like Ancestry or Family Search or wherever you're going with it, make sure that, you have proper permission to do that. So there was another one I was going to suggest.
Is it the virtual cemeteries?
Bingo. That was
Yeah.
it. So you go ahead and tell us about the virtual cemeteries.
I love them. I think it's really great. It's something that I have done when I've either created a memorial, because I do that sometimes if I receive a death certificate or I find it online. I look for the clues about the burial, and then if I can locate the cemetery, I'll create one. And then you're basically grouping all of these burials, the information, into one concise place for yourself. So, even if you have family spread across the US or across the globe, it's kind of this really convenient feature where you can organize everything. And I love being able to create them because it can really, really be something that saves you time in a lot of your research.
Yeah, so for those who are not sure exactly what we're talking about, a virtual cemetery is, like Ashley said, a grouping, but you create it. So it could be the Knox family cemetery, and it could have memorials from 6 different cemeteries all grouped together in my personal virtual Knox family cemetery. So, yeah, that it's really, really cool. Something else that personally don't know a lot about, but I know that sometimes you can find these military cemeteries.
Oh,
If you
yes.
have family members or ancestors that, you know, served in a war or
Mhm.
served in the military, and they may be buried in a military cemetery. So,
Mhm.
do you think there's some really great images, like, there's a military cemetery in France, Normandy, I think it was. Someday, maybe I'll get there, I don't know, but it looks incredible, and so a lot of our American soldiers are buried there as well. So,
Mhm.
how about some tips for taking photographs at a cemetery if you happen to be lucky enough to go visit a cemetery?
I would say definitely don't forget to do the wide shot. That's something that I know you have mentioned before, and I don't know why it just didn't click until you said something, and I went, "Oh, of course, it's that light bulb moment." When you take that wide shot, it makes it so much easier to understand where the grave is in perspective. You can also check to see who's around them. Are they near any other family members? You may find clues in that way.
Yeah, so especially if you can take a high resolution photograph, most of the phones, cell phones do a pretty good job of that. And so I'm always saying take a good quality shot of a tombstone and then step back and take a wide shot. Don't forget to take a photograph of the entrance of the cemetery so that people can get their bearings. A lot of times, these cemeteries, the bigger ones anyway, if they have a website, they often have a map on the website of how to get to different places. And so, if you can, call ahead and talk to the office if there is one. Some of these really tiny little cemeteries don't have one. And maybe in some cases, they're on somebody's personal property. And so you'd have to, of course, get permission. You know, I did this video several years ago. A friend of mine is the superintendent of a historic cemetery here in North Carolina. And he taught me so much about the little symbols and the little icons that you find on the tombstones. And there's a great book called, he turned me on to this book. It's called Stories in Stone. I can leave a link in the description. There's a couple of them too. I couldn't find my other one. I was digging around on the bookshelf earlier this morning and I couldn't find it. But there's a couple of them that I can leave in the Amazon store for Genealogy TV. It's got some really cool stuff. I mean, you can sit there and go through the book and learn about. I remember him telling me that if you find a tombstone that has a tree trunk cut off, it means that life has ended. I mean, there's just so much symbolism to him. There's some symbolism where hands are clasped together, like a husband and wife are on one tombstone, and you'll see hands clasped together, meaning they're together in the afterlife. And it's just some really cool stuff. Another set of clues you can find are symbols about religion. So you may find stars or crosses or even non-religious symbols, things like a rotary emblem or certain societies that a person belonged to that was important in their life. They may have etched it into the tombstone. So really, really cool.
Do you mean like fraternal orders and things like
Yeah.
that too?
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
if, yeah, exactly. There's a bunch of them out there, and so if you see some of those symbols, it might be a clue to go look for see if some of those records might exist. A lot of times that stuff is gonna end up at the local genealogical society, the local historical society in that area, so that might be might be of interest. So, tips for visiting. Let's talk about that. So, if you're going to actually visit a tombstone over the summer, maybe a little road trip, what should you do, Miss Ashley?
Well, to echo what we said earlier, absolutely call ahead if you can. If you notice that there is a small cemetery or you just can't seem to find an office to contact, I suggest you could also try Facebook, believe it or not, because I have noticed there can be either volunteers that just take care of that area. Sometimes they'll organize into different societies or things like that. A local genealogical society may have adopted the cemetery for any reason. I know in my hometown in Philly, there was an issue with a huge, huge cemetery called Mount Moriah. And because of the legal issues that surrounded it, a group of people have created the Friends of Mount Moriah, and they now manage that. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Bring good supplies, lots of fresh water.
Snacks. You may be walking around out there for a while. Maybe
Yeah.
bug spray, sunscreen.
Comfortable clothes, comfortable shoes.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
You might even bring so I did another episode several years ago about visiting cemeteries, and one of the things I suggested that you do is either bring a small rake or a small broom, like a little
Mhm.
hand broom to brush off. Because when you're taking photographs of those tombstones, you don't want a bunch of grass growing over it or something. So maybe some clippers or something that you can help clean it up enough to take a decent photograph. Sometimes a flashlight or a light that you can rake the light sideways to help raise the different indents on the tombstone so that you can see the lettering because sometimes a side light really helps us see it. You know, something we really haven't talked a lot about either is cleaning those tombstones. And so that can be a no-no sometimes. So, you know, we want to try and keep these tombstones preserved as best we can. There is a product, I think it's called D2, I can't remember, but
So,
you always want to ask the family first because they own, you know, if there's surviving family, you wanna ask
absolutely.
them first if there's, you know, crud and stuff on the tombstone, and you wanna ask the office if there is one, because sometimes there are definitely rules against that, which is another thing you should bring is water, because you wanna rinse off any dirt or that kinda stuff. Maybe a little soft brush to help clean things off. I mean, if you're gonna do that, be mindful that it does take some time too, so you may be wanting to be out there ahead of time. As long as you're there, might as well talk to the office if they have one because I bet you they have records. And so a lot of times, if you can find the burial records, the family, the surviving family are the ones who filled out the forms to get somebody buried that paid for the plot or whatever, and so a lot of times those records have family in them as well. So that's always cool. You know, getting back to the genealogical societies for a moment, sometimes that was a project, especially before computers and before all this internet stuff, right?
Mhm.
Genealogical societies a lot of times would go out and adopt a cemetery and do an inventory. Sometimes today even, that is the only record that survives, and, you know, as time goes on, you know, vandals get out there and kick over tombstones or do whatever, and or time or hurricanes and branches come down and break tombstones or whatever, and sometimes those tombstones get destroyed. It might be that that genealogical society in that area is the only one that has that
That's information.
inventory, and so, yeah, that was always a great project for the genealogical societies to get out there and document every burial out there, especially in some of those older ones. Whew, fun stuff.
Mhm.
Oh my goodness. I could talk
Yeah.
about this all day long.
What's interesting, you bring up the concern about vandalism and that sort of thing. I think that's why picnicking fell out of, practice. I think that's part of the reason why it fell out of practice. I don't know if many folks know that it was a popular thing in the 19th century to actually go to a cemetery and picnic.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And, you know, they would go out there with picnic baskets and blankets. And I mean, it was a day in the park, is what it
Mhm.
was. And they would go and sit with their ancestors and loved ones and enjoy the day, especially in the spring and in the fall when the weather was nice. Yeah, and, in some cultures, they have certain days. I know
Mhm.
in the Japanese culture, I believe it is, that they have an actual holiday where they go and visit and clean up the cemeteries, or, the plots around their loved ones. Something we didn't talk about too is, and I'm not a super expert at this, but some of the European cultures reused plots. So sometimes people are looking for their ancestors on Find a Grave in European countries, and sometimes they can't. And it might be because, the land was scarce. A lot of times they just buried people on top of each other, layer after layer, so there's not always a tombstone there for some of the European countries, it just depends. So if anybody has any comments about that, stick it in the comments section. And you know what, if you guys have any tips too, and read the comments, because a lot of times people share some really great tips in the comment sections, and if you guys are finding anything useful here, give us a like. That always helps. And subscribe to the channel for sure.
Mhm.
Any other tips for cemetery research, Miss Ashley, that you can think of?
Not off the top of my head. Did you wanna discuss anything about the military, cemeteries?
I was just getting ready to go back there. So I don't know a lot about researching military cemeteries, but I would imagine that that might fall into some of the military records if you're doing military research. Have you
Yes.
experienced any of that? Because I know you do some military research as well.
So I have a little bit of firsthand knowledge when it comes to, one of my brothers, and I also double checked some of the information from the VA, the Veterans Affairs. It's a big organization here in the US,
Hmm.
but there are requirements through the VA that you need to meet in order to be buried in a national cemetery here. You can also use your benefits if you want to put your loved one in a private cemetery, if you want to make other arrangements, which is what we did with my brother, so that it just depends on what your family's wishes are. But for a person to be buried in a national cemetery here through the VA, you have to have certain eligibility requirements. There are things that you cannot have in your history for to meet the eligibility requirements. For instance, you have to have been discharged of honorable character. You can't have any issues with your conduct while you were both in service and later on in civilian life if you were convicted of any
Oh,
um
interesting.
if you have any convictions for certain crimes, you're not able to utilize your VA benefits. So,
Interesting. And
mhm,
I know, anybody who died during, a conflict or something, they may have automatically been buried in a military cemetery. And of course, that all leaves records.
mhm.
And so if somebody was looking for those records, where would you suggest they go?
I definitely suggest the archives in St. Louis here, St. Louis, Missouri. It's NARA, that's the National Archives and Records Administration. Going there to research any of that time for separation papers. A lot of the times more recent use of the form, it's called a DD 214, but depending on the time frame, that isn't the exact form. It changes over time depending on how far back you're going. For instance, I ordered something for a great great uncle, and he had served during World War II and then shortly after. So he doesn't have a DD 214. It's considered a registry or excuse me, a separation, papers of registration or separation. Keep saying registration. And then that'll also indicate, for the most part, that gives you their service member number. You can look for information in other places like Fold 3 because of that.
Oh, yes, good point.
That's a really good resource to go to if you don't know for sure what you're looking for. If you can gather a few things online and for free, why not? Because then that could help you with any further requests that you ask for from the archives. So gathering up some information ahead of time is always great.
Beautiful. One thing it just occurred to me as we were talking, kind of to rewind a moment about taking photographs in a cemetery. Some of the offices these days are prohibiting that, so make sure you check ahead of time, especially if you're taking video. Been there, done that, got caught. But thankfully, my friend, the superintendent, says, "Go ahead, don't worry about it." But sometimes you can run into a little conflict. I think some cemeteries are worried about privacy issues, and so it just depends. If you're in a 1700, 1800 section of the cemetery, I don't think they're gonna care. But if you're in a, you know, 1970s, 1980s area of the cemetery, they might have an issue, so just be mindful of that you may have to, get permission to take photographs and or video if you are there. And definitely, I know people who like to fly drones in cemeteries, and I would suggest that in a military cemetery, that is against the law because that is considered a national park, and some of those drone flights are prohibited in national parks. So, if you're trying to put together a story for your family, for the upcoming family reunion, and you're going to do a fly over the cemetery or whatever, ask before you take flight because that could be an issue. A way around that, though, is to use Google Earth, the
Oh,
Google
yeah.
Earth Studio. You can actually do flybys that are done from satellite imagery, which could be super cool. Yeah, you can do that pretty easy. And so, anyway, and that's another thing. You could actually search some of these cemeteries, not necessarily by name, but to get a location from Google Earth
Mhm.
or Google Maps or, so be thinking about that if you are trying to get your bearings as to how to get there and what road to take. And you could put the little man, you know how you do that on Google Maps, I think it is. You put the little man on the street and then you can see the entrance,
Walk
so
through.
no,
Mm,
be thinking about that. Very cool. Can't wait to go back and do some cemetery research myself, maybe this summer. Keeping my fingers crossed, we'll see. I don't know, maybe fall when it's not quite so hot.
especially here in the South, yes.
Yes, because it's like,
Yes.
yeah, you get out there for 10 minutes and, like, you're going, "Okay, I'm ready for water and air conditioning." But
Yes.
anyway, well, this has been fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me this morning.
Yeah, of course. I love doing this. I love sharing, and, it's always great to know if other folks benefit from it. So, we do honestly read those comments. If you are wanting to just tell us, a suggestion for a future episode too, we're also open to that.
Oh, good point. Yeah, and don't, hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed to Genealogy TV. We'd love to have you find us again.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll catch you in the next one.
Sounds
Bye.
good. Bye.